Hi, Jesse. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Daniela.
So, as you know, this class is on engaging diverse communities. And I was hoping that you could start by just telling me a little bit about how you've done this in your career and what it means to you.
Engaging diverse communities. Um, yeah, I think at a young age, I liked being a fish out of water. I liked kind of being in places where I could learn the most. And so I started putting myself in those situations. So, I mean, for a lot of us in college, we start by studying abroad, and that's kind of our big transformation to another language and kind of being in a minority, and kind of realizing what that's like. And for me, I just kind of never stopped doing that. I studied abroad in South America and Chile, and there was a lot of the same stuff you've been seeing this summer with protests going on there. And I hadn't really experienced that stuff. And so it was really interesting to be there and witness it and want to write about it and want to, kind of document it in some way. So that's kind of when I started thinking about, how to make that a career. Um, so you want to know like what my methodology is for
I
for
think,
going in? Yeah.
yeah, I'd like to know your methodology, but how you have done this concept of sort of engaging diverse communities. You
Hmm.
work both, your career has been you have done sort of traditional radio reporting, you've done video reporting, you've reported abroad, and then you've also done a lot of journalistic training in different ways in journalism development that's based in
Hmm.
communities. And in all of them, from what I can see, you are going into this concept of engaging diverse communities sort of permeates your career.
Hmm.
But I'm curious if you could give us just a couple of examples of how you have done it. Like if you could tell me about maybe your radio reporting.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think my goal increasingly has been, when you start out as a reporter, you just want to tell interesting stories. And as time goes on, I think if you're a thoughtful reporter, you start to think about, well, how do I enable communities to tell their own stories? Because I'm interpreting, Boyle Heights through my lens as a white dude. And sometimes that's problematic. That's why you see so much coverage of a neighborhood like that. Everyone's telling the same story over and over again about a mural or a coffee shop window being broken. And I think that's where kind of journalism fails. And so increasingly, I've been looking at how to, participate with the community as opposed to drop in and document them. When I started out, I just wanted to go anywhere I didn't know, somewhere interesting, let people talk, and kind of put together a nice little narrative about what's going on. And as you all have read, recently I started partnering with community members on writing op-eds, and that's kind of where I've wound up, which is they have a lot of stories to share that don't need my filtering as much. How do I share my platform with them so that they can have that bigger audience and share their perspective? Um, when I do go and report in a community that I'm not a member of, I always start out by partnering with somebody in that community. Some people call that a fixer. Sometimes it's a translator if you're in another country. But it's somebody who can, walk around with you and help you connect with the community, I think in the right way because they're from it. Um, so I always try and locate that person first, and through that kind of person you just meet all sorts of people, and you're able to, I think, navigate it a little more um, with some better clarity and kind of in a responsible way. um, I'll give you an example, a radio story. When I first moved to LA 4 years ago, I had no frame of reference here. I didn't know the geography. I didn't know the neighborhoods. I do speak Spanish. That's, a language that's pretty common here. So that's kind of one of the ways in which I think I'm able to walk into a community and be a little better in terms of, understanding and listening. Um, and I'd heard from an imam, which is, If you don't know, that's a religious leader in the Muslim community, that more and more Latinx community members were converting to Islam. I'd heard this guy speak at a conference, and I just was really curious about that. And so I called him up, and he pointed me towards a mosque near the University of Southern California, and a Spanish-speaking imam there. And so I spoke with that guy on the phone, and he invited me to come observe one of their meetups. And yeah, I just listened for an hour. I let people get comfortable with me being there. And then a few women wanted to talk to me after I explained why I was there. And this was at the time right around the inauguration for Trump, when both Muslims and Latinx community members were feeling really targeted. And so it was unique that these people were feeling it from two fronts, both a religious one and a cultural one. And I talked to these women after the service, and one of them kept in touch with me, and I went and visited her later at her work. She was married to an Egyptian guy. So, listening first, letting people come to you who want to share something. Immigration is often a sensitive topic. So I think especially giving people an opportunity to come to you and not making them feel like you're shoving a microphone in their face to talk about something that might be problematic for them. And then, kind of being patient and finding other opportunities to just keep in touch and follow up and visit and, be friendly. And the story that came out of that was really interesting about this couple who were an Egyptian guy and a woman who's originally from southern Mexico, and how they got together and why they were terrified and how they were about to sell their business for fear of being deported. And so it took about a month, but I think I went about it the right way and gave them, time to talk about what was going on, and made it very clear to them what the repercussions were of them being on the radio. And they'd reached a point where they didn't care. They thought maybe if they got their story out, it could help them. So that's one example, more
That's
recent
a great
example.
one.
Yeah.
That a lot of the questions that students asked after reading and listening to a few of your stories had to do with this. You go often into challenging situations. Tiffany wrote, you get what you write about or contribute is very personal, from the perspective of a hardworking teenager, or a heartbroken mother, or just someone trying to survive. How do you feel that you have to desensitize yourself to the people you write about going into the interview?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think reporters don't realize the trauma they cause themselves on a regular basis. You and I at least internalize it. I think I often feel exhausted after spending the day with somebody who's traumatized, in trouble, on the run, scared, homeless, you name it. It's really like you find that you're holding your breath when you're talking to those people. I think I also get quieter. I have questions written out. I have lots of things I want to understand. But I find what often happens if they've agreed to talk to me is it's more of a process of, how did that feel? What was that like? Tell me more about that. Having them show you what's going on. One of the people I interviewed last fall who's homeless, unhoused, we met up in a park. Where do you meet somebody who's unhoused? She likes this park. That's somewhere she goes to write and to work sometimes. And she has a car. So I got her to give me a tour of her car. What's in her car? When she had to leave her apartment, she put what she could in her car. And so that's, you think about everything that's in your apartment or your bedroom and think about putting that in your car. It's a really interesting tour to get of someone's home. And in her car, she had a Christmas ornament. That was like her prized possession. I asked her if there was one thing that she couldn't imagine not having, and that was it. It was something her dad had always put on their Christmas tree. and so I think like you focus on kind of the minutia of stuff that everybody shares, like things you care about, things you like. And I find that really helpful when I'm talking to someone who's in a really difficult situation, because um, it's a way to relate to them, because you're both human beings, right? You're not looking at them just as a homeless person. You're looking at them as somebody who had a dad that they loved, who has, you know, a book that they're reading that they're really interested in. And I think that's really, you have to get to a point where you can see people in difficult situations as just people like you. Um, and I also think, you know, thinking about covering communities that are not your community, there's a tendency for the Latinx community is a great example. It is so diverse and so complicated. It is not homogenous, and yet it gets covered by white people like me as a very homogenous entity. Latinos are one thing. But if you spend any time in the community, a Gen Z Latinx person, his parents probably aren't using Latinx for a variety of reasons. They may not speak English. They have a very different politics, probably. You know, they may have been born in Central America or Mexico. Such different experiences. And so I think when reporters go into communities that they don't know, it's really important to see them as complicated and as, again, just human beings. I help out a community media outlet here called Boyle Heights Beat, and what I like about it is it's mostly community members who are trained to be journalists. They don't see Boyle Heights as a homogenous Latinx universe. They see it as a universe where there's corruption, where there's small businesses, where COVID is hitting really hard, where people can't afford housing. And those are all like things that lots of people experience. And they happen to be predominantly Latinx. But I think that's the place you have to get to, is to view people as individuals and human beings who are going through things. And that's what enables you to, like, I think, do good reporting. And I also pick hard topics because I feel like I'm just drawn to them to understand them. The homeless issue in LA is crazy, and I see it every day. I live near it, I walk around it, and part of me hates that people are living outside, and part of me really wants to understand why they're there. And so I have to like side with the part of me that's curious and go in and learn what I can. And I think it's, you know, it's a really important job to try and help people express that experience. So people who ignore it or don't want to deal with it, you know, maybe they get a window into, you know, what the details are, what the realities are. That's what I'm after, is to kind of understand those experiences. Because I'm, you know, a white guy, and I have privilege to walk in places. I'm not questioned. I have privilege as a reporter. And so I try and use those honestly to, you know, get to know people and help them tell their stories, just to be honest.
There were a lot of questions about how you find so many different people. You know, how do you find a mother in Pakistan who's lost her child? How do you find Lupe who's crossing the border to go to school, or
Mm-hmm.
someone in Guatemala, or someone who's decided not to to pursue his American dream in Mexico? How do you find
Right.
all of these people is a question that a lot of students were asking.
Yeah. So, you know, usually for me, it takes meeting, I call them like gatekeepers, people who are very connected to certain communities. In the case of the story I did about unhoused people in Orange County, there's a woman who's works for the ACLU, and she works on housing issues, and she makes a point of being out in high density areas where people are unhoused. She knows everybody. So it's me calling up her, hey Ann, just checking in, saying hi. What are you seeing that's different than a year ago, the last time we talked? And she said to me, oh, there's these two women, they're agitating inside these these shelters because the conditions are so bad. You really got to talk to them. And so I talk to them and I get a sense of like, are they able to tell a story? Are they, able to articulate kind of the issue that's going on? And so it's finding kind of, there's a person in between the people you probably want to talk to and the issue. And it's working with them to kind of identify people who are examples of the issue you're trying to talk about. In the case of the mother whose daughter was killed in a school shooting, I had done a previous radio story about that, talking mostly to the student who died's cousin who was studying abroad in the US. She wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that I saw, and I read it and I just was so angry. As a former exchange student, it just pissed me off that like this person came here to this country I live in and wasn't safe. And yet we view her country, Pakistan, as like the most unsafe place you could ever visit. I'd also been to Pakistan a bunch of times and really, connected with people there. And so part of me felt a little bit of obligation to try and find a way to talk about this because I don't think the story had been told. I mean, 13 people died. I think 13 people died in that school shooting. But it felt particularly egregious to me that a foreign exchange student who was not choosing to be in the US, because it's unsafe, died. And so I connected with her cousin and we talked and I interviewed her. And then I found someone here in LA who works with exchange students. And I did a story about that. And it lingered for me because I felt like the real person I needed to talk to the entire time was the mom. And it just took another 6 months for me to think of a way to work with her. And so I worked through her younger daughter who could translate. And I called her 2 or 3 times just to talk because, as some of you pointed out in your questions, it's like, it's emotional, it's sensitive. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to this woman. You don't just call her up and like ask her a ton of questions. You call her up and you say, look, I'm so sorry. And I'm just curious if you'd be willing to tell me more about her. And so it took a few phone calls. And I just felt like, all right, well, would you be interested in telling your story and I'll help you do it? And that was kind of more an example of me using my relationship with the newspaper here for her to have that opportunity. It wasn't me telling her story. And I felt much better about that. But it's hard. It's sad. She was crying. Her daughter was crying. It's, and again, you like internalize that. But I feel like if you don't do that, you're kind of avoiding, the reality of these situations. And if you don't share that story, people aren't going to take it as seriously as they should, this issue. And I just feel strongly about, if you can hear from people who are impacted by these things, maybe, you'll at least be more interested in the issues.
So one way that you clearly do reporting that engages diverse communities is that you're in some ways, word is skipping, like not a mediator, but you're creating that connection. Mm-hmm. And so you're using your professional journalism skills to facilitate someone else telling their own story. And you do that sometimes through reporting and sometimes through these sort of as told to opinion stories. Mm-hmm. But then you're also running this broad collective mm-hmm. that works with helping people to create their own reporting outlets on the communities they serve. And can you tell us a little bit, there were a bunch of questions about the listening post as well and how that came to be.
So I kind of got going in journalism in Chicago. I'm from the Midwest, and I was covering the mayor and running around and doing like 1-minute radio stories every day on what's happening in the city. And that was fun. I learned a lot. But at some point, somebody hired me to be part of a education public radio project at a high school on Chicago's West Side. And it was an all-girls Catholic school, and the students were Black, Latina, and Eastern European, many of them immigrants. And none of their families were families who would hear the stories I was doing on the radio. And yet my goal was to get them to do public radio. And I kind of had an epiphany of like, well, I'm trying to force them into this construct that somebody created that's mostly dominated by white voices and listened to by white audiences. I believe in the reporting. So it's a shame that the reporting isn't coming from, you know, a more diverse group of people. And it's also a shame that that reporting isn't reaching a more diverse group of people. And so it kind of, you know, set off a light bulb in my head. Well, how do we change that? And so in addition to just continuing to be a reporter, I just really wanted to find ways to increase the benefit of journalism throughout the city of Chicago. I tried a few little experiments on my own. So one thing I did was, if I did a story for a national public radio show, I did one about a group of people who live below the poverty level, never finished high school, and were taking college courses in literature and art history and things like that. And it was a really cool program. And I did this radio story about them. And then I went back to their class and I played the story for them. And they got to give me feedback on how I made them sound. And it was good for me because it was like, you know, you got that wrong, or that's a generalization, or, you know, a lot of them, it was fun for them to hear their, you know, their perspectives on the radio. And then I gave them CDs, that'll tell you how old I am, to take back and play for their families. And, you know, it was a little experiment, but I felt like at least I was bringing the story to a group of folks who weren't probably going to hear it otherwise. So I've been obsessed with that now going on 15 years. How do you like increase awareness and access to journalism and increase equity in terms of who's doing it? You all are good examples. Like, journalism's hard to get into. There aren't a ton of jobs. And so now what I'm trying to do is, okay, how do I help, you know, folks who really want to educate and inform their communities, start things that may not exist already in terms of journalism, or if they are doing stuff, even if it's a Facebook group, how do they expand on that and professionalize it and make it long lasting? And so that's what I'm up to. So right now, just to give you an example, I'm talking to a lot of people in the Inland Empire, and trying to figure out how that community shares news, because there's very few news outlets that cover it. And it's a huge, huge part of California. It's geographically, it's enormous, and it's not covered very comprehensively. And so what you start to see is community members with Facebook groups and Instagram pages, and some of the news is verified and some of it isn't. And it's interesting to talk to the people doing it and what's motivating you. You know, are you getting paid to do this? And figure out which ones are really interested in journalism and which ones are just kind of enjoying, you know, social media fame. And yeah, can we do something more with this? Would you like to, like, you know, professionalize it a little bit, or find a grant to help you do more with it? So that's what I am trying to do now. And I think the end goal is, I think we all feel like there's media, legacy media, newspapers, the LA Times, you know, the paper wherever you live, if it still has one. We think of, you know, local TV and public radio. Those are the things we know, that's local journalism. But it traditionally hasn't been very diverse, and it traditionally hasn't covered the diversity of this country very well. And so what's to say, you know, somebody doing some bilingual effort in Boyle Heights, why can't that be, you know, the legacy media of the future? Like, why can't something that might be small now be the main news source for a community, made by people from that community who have a much better understanding of how to cover it? So that's kind of like pie in the sky. Yeah.
I want to get, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I want to get to one last question, which is, coming from two students, Ro noted that when you're going into a new community, it's really hard to know where to start.
Mhm.
And she said, your 7 steps that you did in the listening post were helpful to her to think about it. How did you come up with these 7 steps? Where do they come from? And then
Yeah.
Ozzy asked about one of them. I like this idea of like, setting up a listening post. But if you put it up in my community, I think people would just, what did he say exactly? I want to get your quote exactly, Ozzy. But I feel like if one existed where I live, folks would abuse it and fill it up with nonsense.
um, so the original listening post, the recording devices, I think you're referring to, that's something I've only done in one place, New Orleans. And I based what I did in New Orleans off of things that I had done in other countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka and parts of Latin America. And um, what you see when you leave the United States is, and especially if you visit um, lower income countries, developing countries, you see a lot of grassroots efforts in terms of journalism. And it's really inspiring. Like, people do all sorts of amazing things. I think my favorite project in the world is in Liberia, and it's a traffic circle. And this guy has this enormous billboard, and he puts up news headlines and he changes them throughout the day. It's called Front Page, I think. And it's accessible. People see it. It's it's organic. It changes every day. Like, it's the front page of a newspaper, but in a country with a ton of traffic, people are stuck. They're going to see that. They're going to get that information. I love examples like that. And so I'm always trying to think about, all right, how do we put news in spaces that people are constantly going to kind of come into contact with it, whether it's digital or whether it's out in the real world. And so when I started this thing in New Orleans, I wanted to try something that was offline and something that was more digital. And so what I did was I created a text messaging news network all over the city. That was kind of the more digital aspect. And people got news on their phones and they could answer questions and share experiences. And then I did the same thing with these physical recording devices. The way that I prevented them from getting massively vandalized was by partnering with community institutions like libraries, um, community businesses like barbershops, grocery stores, and going to community events. Um, and yeah, you do get folks recording things that make no sense or they think it's funny. Um, but that's going to happen. That happens online. If you get 2 or 3 comments that are really sincere and thoughtful out of 15, you've got 3 things to work with. And I always got that kind of content. Um, and I think if you ask important and honest questions, I think the vast majority of people, if they're going to bother doing it, hopefully they'll share something, insightful. I also made some of the listening posts kind of playful. One was a tree. There's a fish. He's right here in the corner of my room. And they were playful, and that's very culturally appropriate in New Orleans, which is all about kind of art and public parades and things. I wound up designing them to be a little more run of the mill, just for to make them more feasible and easy to use. But yeah, just try things. I think in LA, I haven't done as much of this. One thing I'm working on with Boyle Heights Beat is to create a digital map for people to know where all the COVID resources are in their community. So it's centralized, so they know where you can get tested, where you can get food assistance, where you can find help in terms of housing and job stuff. So just really thinking about how you're going to get in front of people and what kind of information you can share with them that they might be able to use. And that's kind of how the listening post works. It's based on observing a community asking them questions about themselves, how they get and share information, and then experimenting with what they've told you and trying to stick news in the spaces that they spend time digitally and offline.
Finally, Jesse, if you were to give one piece of advice to a young reporter or a young you as a reporter, what's the piece of advice you would give right now? Or what's the best advice you got?
I think you all, as journalism students or people interested in media, I think you often have really good story ideas, especially, you know, in your own communities, things that you may not even be aware of, but you see every day could make a really good story. So I just think, you know, whether or not you're getting paid to do that first story or if it's for a grade, to really put everything you have into it and go investigate it. I had a small community radio workshop this summer for people on the east side of LA, and it was all on Zoom. And these aren't people who'd studied journalism or done much journalism. And they had the best story ideas. And it was because they were things that they were curious about. And I think they didn't even think of them as journalism or news. They just knew that if they could tell a story, that's what it would be. And so I feel like if you start with something you're curious about and you're really interested in, that will sustain some of the more frustrating aspects of this, which can be getting paid. You know, writing for some people sucks. People, you know, don't always like writing. That's a part of this. Even if you're doing radio or video, you have to write a script. So figure out like something you're curious in, and also figure out one part of the process of making it a story that you really like. For me, I actually like writing a lot. Doing interviews kind of, you know, makes me a little anxious. And so I'm always nervous before I go into an interview. But once I have the interview, I'm so excited because I know what I want to do with it. Some friends of mine love the interview part and they hate writing. So figure out
I
some,
love flatter.
figure out one aspect of it that you enjoy. And maybe it's like you like designing. So, you know, figure out how to design something for Instagram that reflects your story. Or, yeah, maybe you love shooting video. But figure out something you really like because that will help you get through the parts you don't. That's my advice.
Thank you, Jesse. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Good luck with your stories and feel free to email me any questions.
Thank you.